everyone, welcome back to another vlog. The weather in Melbourne is getting very cold. It's heading out of autumn and into winter, and it's actually one of my favourite times of the year, but it is also very cold. So I spent the day in my studio today, and I thought I would bring you guys along and show you what I've been doing and what I've been up to. The last time I spoke to you all, I was a bit sick and well at home, and I'm happy to say that my cold has now disappeared, but my hip problems are still here. I actually ended up having a steroid injection or a cortisone injection in my hip on Friday last week, and that was eventful. It was actually a lot more painful than I was expecting it to be, and I wasn't able to stand on my leg at all the next day. So I spent most of the weekend just sitting and relaxing, and this was the first time that I'd gotten back into the studio so far after having that done. So I had that done on Friday, and when I was filming this it was Wednesdays. The main goal that I wanted to have for the studio session that I was here today was to finish off a commission that I've been working on. This is the commission here. It's a large landscape, and I started about a week ago, and this commission is based on the client's sort of local area that they live in. I believe it's behind their property. The clients sent through reference images that they had taken, and I based the composition and the general layout of this artwork on those reference images. And besides that, the only other brief was to keep it bright and happy, and they wanted nice vibrant colours and a real richness to the landscape, so that's kind of what I aimed for. I didn't have to do too much to this landscape. It was almost done. All I really wanted to do was boost up the vibrancy in some of the colours in the foreground, sort of mix up the colours in the paddock a little bit. I didn't want them to be quite just flat colours, so I wanted to add a little bit of variation in the values in those fields. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just adding in a bit more oomph and interest into those colours, and adding a little bit more texture in the form of brush strokes as well. One of the most satisfying parts of painting these landscapes is when I come in and add the final details. So the main things that I kind of had to emphasise and add in the last few details on this piece was just boosting up the contrast and some of these little trees and details in the background. It really makes a big difference when you add in those touches of super dark and just little dots and dashes of trees and poles or bushes in the background. It makes a huge difference to the depth of the artwork and lifts a lot of the brighter colours up and makes it a lot more interesting. So I just added a few more little details in here and there, and then I decided that I was pretty happy with it and decided it was done. I will now photograph this artwork and send the photographs to the client, and once they've approved them and they're happy with the artwork, it will be varnished and then framed and then shipped over to them. I decided that I was going to start a new piece today, and so I cleaned up my brushes and reset my area and popped up a new canvas. I'd been kind of thinking about doing this painting for the last few days while I was resting at home. I had a photo that I had taken of the river near my home, sort of standing across the bridge and looking up the river, and it had a lot of really nice light in this photo, and so I kind of wanted to capture the light on the trees and the reflections in the water, which is something that I've been sort of focusing on in my work a little bit lately. However, I didn't really know much more besides that, so I did spend a little time in the beginning working out what colours I was going to use in this artwork, because I generally find that once I sort out my colour palette and I work out the colour direction and the colour story that I'm going to use, I can then progress with the artwork and it makes it a lot easier for it to come together. So here I am just working out the colours. I kind of knew, based on the reference image that I had and what I wanted the artwork to look like, I kind of knew that I wanted cool colours, and so I just mixed up a few cool blues and cool greens with grey tones in them to start with as a bit of a starting point, just to see whether they would work nicely together. And once I had established those colours, I then decided to just put together a quick little tonal sketch of the composition and put the colours together in a little image, because I find that sometimes when I mix up colours, they look really nice next to each other on like a swatch, like on this sketchbook page. They look nice together next to each other, but once you start mixing them and blending them in the context of a painting, sometimes they don't really work as well. There's not enough contrast, or there's not enough variation, or something is not quite right with them. So I decided to just do a little mini sketch of these colours together, just to make sure that they are actually going to work before I commit to painting them on a larger scale. So once I had worked out my colour story, I jumped in and blocked in my canvas, and I just blocked in a rough composition, and I used a combination of the colours that I'd sort of pre-mixed to block in roughly where things were going to go. So where the trees were, where the river was going to sit, the shadows, and it's just a really super loose block in as like a rough idea of where things are going to go. This is where I usually start, and the painting then kind of develops from this point onwards. The next thing that I wanted to make sure I got into this painting was these bright patches of sunlight that were hitting some of the trees. I the reason that I was drawn to the photo that I took in the first place was because there was these brighter trees that the sun was sort of coming through and hitting the tops of, and it contrasted really nicely with all the dark shadow areas that were in this photo. So I wanted to make sure that I had this bright, vibrant green coming through all the cooler blue colours, and I made sure that that was all in place first before I sort of went too much further with it. If you're somebody that wants to learn how to paint in a really loose manner like this, there's a couple of things I guess I could suggest that you do. Firstly, even when you're working with an initial reference photo or a reference idea, I would recommend not actually painting with that photo in front of you. So you can see I don't have the reference photo anywhere in front of me. I know in my mind what it looked like, and so I'm just using that image in my mind that I have as my starting point. Because if you have a reference photo in front of you, the temptation is there to replicate it too much. And instead of painting intuitively and loosely, you're going to be worried about the placement of everything. So I would recommend that you kind of just put down general loose shapes and really bold marks first, and don't worry about detail. I always sort of start large and then work into the smaller details later on. These, the colours and the tones that I'm using, they're going to be adjusted as I go along and as the piece starts to come together, and that's just part of the layering process. And I find that a lot of people that begin painting tend to paint really tight to begin with, especially if you sketch it, or like I mentioned, if you're working from a reference, you start really tight, and once you start tight, you're just going to keep tightening up. Another thing that will help you loosen up and paint more expressively is to make sure you use a nice large brush, and especially with acrylic paint, make sure your paint is nice and watery. Don't make it too thick. Make sure that it's got movement in it. You'll see that I occasionally spray down my canvas. This is just water, and I find that helps sort of loosen up the paint a little bit more. And yeah, paint with larger brushes. That's a great way to sort of loosen up, because you can't paint too much detail with a large brush. So once I've blocked in the rough sort of shapes and colours, I then come in with a smaller brush and just start emphasising different areas of the painting, such as, the branches. And I really wanted that really loose, scraggly kind of bush feeling that the photo had. So while the paint is still a little bit wet, I just push the colours around, and you can see that it's kind of already got the sense of the composition and the details happening in the painting. And yeah, I was really happy with the colours as well at this stage. I think the colours worked quite well, and I decided to just wait for it to dry, and then I added in a few details. But by this stage, I'd sort of been standing in the studio for about 3 hours, and my hip was starting to hurt. So it was kind of at this point where I realised I wasn't going to get this painting done, and so I ended up just putting in a few little details and getting it to a point where I was happy to leave it. And then I decided to just call it quits and head home, because there was no point pushing it. I'd been told by the doctor that it can take a while for the steroid injection to sort of help and work, and that I really should be taking it easy. So on doctor's advice, I packed up my paints and washed everything up, and then I headed home. Before I got home though, I did actually stop in at a local op shop or thrift shop or whatever you want to call it, and I picked up this book. It was 50 cents. And the reason it caught my eye was because it has all these really beautiful colour photos of shrubs and plants that you can find in Australia. Now, they're not native Australian flowers, but they're what you can, generally find in people's gardens. It's an old book, but it has really, really nice pictures in it. And I actually thought that if the photos made really nice compositions on their own, and I thought that it might be fun to maybe one day sit down and use these photos as reference images for small floral paintings, just to focus, each painting focusing on one of these flowers. And I thought that might be fun. So if you're interested in seeing me do that, then let me know in the comments, and maybe I can do some flower paintings in gouache based on these pictures. And I also thought that you might be interested to see how the artwork ended up, because I did go back to the studio the following day and finish this piece, and this is what it looks like. I really love it. It's not exactly what I had envisioned. I feel like the water area looks a bit more like a path than water. I don't know, but I still really love it. I think it's beautiful. The colours are lovely, and I was quite happy with it. And also I should mention as well that if you're interested in looking at more of my art or purchasing my art, I have originals and prints available on my website. You can go to my website, and then there is a shop section, and in that shop section you can find original artworks on paper, prints, all sorts of things, and I do ship internationally as well. So if you'd like to have a look, I will put a link to my website in the description. And I also would like to mention that I do have Skillshare classes available. So if you would like to learn some of the techniques that I use to create my artworks in a bit more detail, then you can hop onto Skillshare, and I have classes available that you can watch. And thanks again for joining me, and I will see you in my next video.